Good evening and welcome back. Tonight, we're rolling across the heart of America, through a land where the horizon stretches so far it seems to curve with the earth itself. Get yourself settled in, maybe pour some coffee, because we've got miles to cover and stories to tell. Tonight, it's Kansas. There's something about Kansas that changes you. Not right away, maybe. Not in the first hour of driving, but somewhere around mile marker 50 or 60 on Interstate 70, as you're leaving the gentle hills of eastern Kansas behind, something shifts. The land opens up like a book you didn't know you were reading, page after page of grass and wheat and sky. And that horizon line, that thin seam where earth meets heaven, it starts to feel less like a destination and more like a companion. It moves with you, never gets closer, never falls behind, just rides along, steady as your shadow. I've crossed this state more times than I can count. Early mornings when the sun comes up like a fireball over fields still wet with dew. Afternoons when the heat makes the air shimmer and dance above the blacktop. Nights when there's nothing but stars and your headlights and the occasional glow of a town 20 miles off. And every single time, Kansas reminds me why I took to the road in the first place. It's not flashy. It doesn't shout for attention like the mountains or the coasts, but there's an honesty here, a straightforwardness that gets into your bones. Folks who have never driven across Kansas, they'll tell you it's boring. Flat and empty, they say, nothing to see, but truckers know better. We know that this land is anything but empty. Every acre has a story. Every town, no matter how small, has a history that stretches back through cowboys and homesteaders, through native warriors and frontier violence, through wheat harvests and dust storms and determination. Kansas isn't empty, it's full. Full of memory, full of work, full of the kind of quiet that lets you hear yourself think for the first time in weeks. They call it the Sunflower State officially, but it's got other names too. The Wheat State, the Breadbasket of the world, the Heartland. And when you're driving through it, when you're hauling 40 tons of freight across its width on that ribbon of highway they call Interstate 70, you understand why. This is the middle of everything, the center point, the place that feeds the nation and asks for nothing but the chance to keep doing its work. So tonight, we're taking our time. We're going to start at the beginning, back when this land belonged to the buffalo and the people who followed them. We'll walk through the violence that birthed this state, the cattle drives that made it legendary, and the wheat that made it rich. We'll talk about the Flint Hills and the ghost towns, about truck stops and sunsets, about why Kansas matters and why it always will. Because this isn't just a state you drive through. It's a place that's been at the center of American history since before there was an America. And if you listen close enough, if you watch the way the wind moves through those wheat fields, you can still hear all those old stories whispering. Long before anyone called this place Kansas, before there were highways or wheat fields or even the notion of states and borders, this land belonged to the people of the tall grass. The archaeological record tells us that humans have lived on these plains for more than 10,000 years, but the story really picks up around 1450. When the Wichita people founded a city that would have taken your breath away. They called it Etzanoa, and it sat along the Walnut River in what's now south-central Kansas. Picture this, a settlement spreading across 20 square miles, home to perhaps 20,000 people. That made it larger than London at the time, larger than anything the Spanish conquistadors had seen in North America. The Wichita built beehive-shaped grass houses, cultivated crops, hunted buffalo, and created a trading network that stretched for hundreds of miles. But by 1700, Etzanoa was gone. Disease, warfare, drought. The reasons are still debated by historians. But the city vanished back into the prairie, and for centuries its existence was forgotten, remembered only in Spanish accounts that people dismissed as exaggeration. The native peoples who lived here when Europeans arrived were primarily the Kansa, or Kaw people, for whom the state is named. Their name comes from a Siouan word meaning people of the south wind, and they lived primarily along the Kansas River and its tributaries. To the south roamed the Osage, a powerful nation that controlled vast hunting grounds. To the west, the Pawnee dominated the plains, following the buffalo herds across an ocean of grass. And in the southwest, the Wichita, descendants of those who had built Etzanoa, continued their agricultural way of life. These weren't the wandering, primitive peoples that old Western movies portrayed. They had sophisticated societies, trade networks, diplomatic relationships, and conflicts. The Kansa moved their main village to the confluence of the Kansas and Big Blue Rivers around 1790, near what's now Manhattan, Kansas. They called it Blue Earth Village, and from there they hunted, traded, and maintained their way of life that had endured for generations. Then came the explorers. In 1804, Lewis and Clark passed through the northeastern corner of what would become Kansas, camping for 3 days where the Kansas and Missouri rivers meet. They traded with the Kansa people and noted the fertility of the land. 2 years later, in 1806, Lieutenant Zebulon Pike passed through on a different expedition, and he looked out at these rolling plains and wrote something in his journal that would shape U.S. policy for the next 40 years. He called it the Great American Desert. Now, Pike wasn't completely wrong. Compared to the green forests of the East, these plains were different. The rainfall was less. Trees were scarce except along the rivers. But calling it a desert was like calling the ocean empty because you can't see the fish. The land teemed with life. Millions of buffalo, elk, and antelope by the thousands. Prairie chickens, wolves, coyotes, and birds beyond counting. And beneath the grass lay some of the richest soil on the planet, soil that would one day feed the world. But that label stuck. The Great American Desert. And because of it, the U.S. government decided this land wasn't fit for white settlement. Instead, starting in the 1820s and 1830s, they designated Kansas as Indian Territory. They began forcibly removing tribes from the eastern United States and resettling them here. The Cherokee, the Delaware, the Shawnee, the Potawatomi, the Ottawa, the Kickapoo, dozens of tribes were pushed westward onto this land, promised it would be theirs as long as grass grows and water flows. The promises lasted about 30 years. The Louisiana Purchase of 1803 had made this territory American. In 1825, the Kansa Nation ceded 20 million acres to the United States and was confined to a reservation in the northeast part of their traditional lands. The Osage were similarly restricted to a reservation in the southeast. But as white settlers pushed westward, as the idea of manifest destiny took hold, as railroad companies and land speculators saw profit in those endless acres, the pressure to open Kansas to white settlement became overwhelming. Fort Leavenworth was established in 1827, the first permanent white settlement in Kansas. Over the next decades, trading posts and missions appeared, and illegal squatters began moving onto native lands despite the treaties. The writing was on the wall. The native peoples had been moved once from their ancestral homes in the east. Now they were about to be moved again, pushed further south into what would become Oklahoma, or confined to ever smaller reservations. Today, 4 Native American reservations remain in Kansas: the Iowa, Kickapoo, Potawatomi, and Sac and Fox. But driving through Kansas, you can still feel the presence of those who came before. River names remember them: the Kansas, the Arkansas, the Neosho. Town names echo their languages: Topeka, Wichita, Shawnee. And sometimes in the quiet of early morning, when the mist rises off the fields and the first light touches the hills, you can almost see them: the hunters on horseback, the women tending crops, the children playing by the river. The land remembers, even when we forget. If there's one period that defines Kansas, one era that set the course not just for this state but for the entire nation, it's the violent years between 1854 and 1861. They called it Bleeding Kansas, and the name fits. Blood was spilled here, in small doses and large, in midnight raids and broad daylight murders, all over a question that had been tearing the country apart since its founding: slavery. In May of 1854, Congress passed the Kansas-Nebraska Act. The idea was simple, at least on paper. Let the people who actually settled in these new territories decide for themselves whether to allow slavery. They called it popular sovereignty, and the politicians thought it was a compromise that would finally put the slavery question to rest. Instead, it was like striking a match in a gunpowder factory. Both sides saw Kansas as the battleground that would determine the future. Pro-slavery forces, mostly from neighboring Missouri, poured across the border. They were called border ruffians, and they came armed and ready to vote, whether they actually lived in Kansas or not. Anti-slavery settlers from the North, organized by immigrant aid societies, flooded in with the same determination. Free state men, they called themselves, and they too came prepared to fight for what they believed. Kansas Territory became a pressure cooker of ideology, ambition, fear, and rage. The violence started almost immediately. In the first territorial elections, thousands of pro-slavery Missourians crossed the border to cast illegal ballots, establishing a pro-slavery legislature in Lecompton. The Free State forces rejected this bogus legislature and set up their own government in Topeka. Kansas now had two governments, each claiming legitimacy, each prepared to use force to get their way. The situation was absurd and terrifying in equal measure. In May of 1856, things exploded. On May 21st, a pro-slavery mob descended on Lawrence, Kansas, the heart of Free State sentiment. They burned buildings, destroyed printing presses, and ransacked the Free State Hotel. Though only one person died, newspapers across the North condemned the sack of Lawrence as proof that slave-holding interests would stop at nothing to force their will on free people. 3 days later, a man named John Brown delivered his response. John Brown was not a man for halfway measures. He was a radical abolitionist who believed that slavery was such a profound evil that violence against it was not just justified but divinely ordained. He saw the sack of Lawrence and heard about the brutal caning of Senator Charles Sumner on the Senate floor by a pro-slavery congressman, and he decided that something had to be done, something dramatic, something that would show the pro-slavery forces that Free State men would fight back. On the night of May 24th, 1856, Brown and a small group including his sons made their way to Pottawatomie Creek. They went to the homes of pro-slavery settlers, men they believed were involved in harassment and violence against Free State families. They dragged 5 men from their cabins, James Doyle and 2 of his sons, Allen Wilkinson and William Sherman, and they killed them with broadswords, hacked them to death, left their bodies in the dark. The Pottawatomie massacre sent shockwaves through Kansas and the nation. It wasn't the first violence of the territorial period, but it was cold, calculated, and brutal in a way that couldn't be ignored. The killings kicked off what became known as Bleeding Kansas, a guerrilla war that would rage across the territory for the next 3 years. Raids and counter-raids, ambushes and murders, Free State settlements attacked by pro-slavery militias, pro-slavery settlements burned by Free State fighters. The death toll varied depending on who was counting, but historians estimate at least 56 people died in politically motivated violence, with the real number likely much higher. John Brown became a hunted man, but also a hero to many in the North. He left Kansas in 1856, but he hadn't finished his war against slavery. 3 years later, in October of 1859, he led a raid on the federal armory at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, hoping to spark a slave rebellion. The raid failed. Brown was captured, tried, and hanged. But his actions in Kansas and Virginia helped push the nation toward the Civil War that everyone could see coming, but no one could stop. Kansas entered the Union as a free state on January 29, 1861, just weeks before the Civil War began. The struggle here had been a preview, a tragic prelude, as one historian called it. The violence in Kansas proved that the slavery question couldn't be solved through compromise or popular sovereignty. It could only be settled through war. Today, if you drive through eastern Kansas, you can visit the places where this history happened. In Lawrence, markers show where the Free State Hotel stood before it was destroyed. Near Lane, Kansas, there's a monument at the site of the Potawatomi Massacre. In Osawatomie, you can visit the John Brown Museum. The land is peaceful now, covered in farms and towns and highways, but the echoes of those years remain. Bleeding Kansas changed the nation's trajectory. It proved that some questions can't be answered with ballots alone. And it showed that even in the middle of America, far from the plantations of the South and the cities of the North, the fundamental questions of freedom and justice had to be fought for, paid for in blood and fire. After the Civil War, Kansas transformed again. The violence that had defined the 1850s gave way to a different kind of wildness, one that involved thousands of longhorn cattle, cowboys on horseback, and boom towns that sprang up along the railroad lines like mushrooms after a rain. This was the era of the cattle drive, and Kansas was at its heart. The story starts in Texas. During the war, while men were off fighting, cattle in Texas multiplied like mad. By 1866, there were millions of longhorns roaming the state, worth about $4 a head in Texas. But up north and back east, where beef was scarce, those same cattle could bring $40 or more. The problem was getting them there. The direct route through Missouri was blocked. Missouri had quarantine laws against Texas cattle, which carried ticks that spread a disease called Texas fever to local herds. What the cattlemen needed was a new route and a new destination. Enter Joseph G. McCoy, an Illinois livestock dealer with vision and ambition. In 1867, McCoy came to Kansas looking for a place to build stockyards where Texas cattlemen could ship their herds east by rail. He was turned down by several towns. Nobody wanted thousands of wild cattle and rough cowboys descending on their communities. But McCoy finally found a place that would work. Abilene, Kansas, a tiny settlement of dugouts and sod houses on the Kansas Pacific Railway. McCoy went to work. He built stockyards that could hold 3,000 cattle. He constructed a hotel, the Drover's Cottage, to house the cattlemen. And he sent riders south to Texas with a message: bring your herds to Abilene. The first drive arrived in 1867, 400 head of cattle brought by O.W. Wheeler. By the end of that first season, 35,000 head had been shipped east from McCoy's pens. The Abilene Trail was born, and it would soon be known by another name, the Chisholm Trail. The trail was named for Jesse Chisholm, a Cherokee trader who had blazed part of the route through Oklahoma. But the drovers extended it, creating a path that ran from San Antonio, Texas, all the way north through Indian Territory and into Kansas. The drive took about 2 months. A typical herd numbered between 2,000 and 3,000 head, managed by about 10 cowboys, a cook with a chuck wagon, and a wrangler to handle the remuda of horses. They moved slowly, averaging 8 to 10 miles a day, letting the cattle graze as they went. By the time the Longhorns reached Abilene, they'd gained 80 to 100 pounds each, fattened on the rich prairie grass. Life on the trail was hard. Cowboys dealt with river crossings, storms, stampedes, and the constant threat of rustlers or hostile encounters. They sang songs to calm the cattle at night, rode in all weather, ate beans and biscuits, and slept on the ground with their saddles for pillows. The work was grueling, dangerous, and paid poorly, maybe $1 a day. But it was also freedom of a sort, adventure under the big sky, and for young men looking for something beyond the farm or the factory, the cattle drive held a romantic appeal. When they finally reached Abilene, the cowboys got paid, and many of them hit the town hard. They'd been on the trail for 2 months with no whiskey, no women, and no entertainment beyond the bawling of cattle and the stars overhead. Abilene gave them all 3. Saloons lined Texas Street. Gambling dens ran day and night. Dance halls offered companionship for a price. The town's reputation as a wild place grew with every passing season. But Abilene was just the first. As the railroad pushed westward, and as settlers moved onto the land around Abilene, forcing the cattle trade to relocate, other Kansas towns had their moment in the sun. Newton boomed for one glorious year in 1871, with 27 saloons and enough violence that they called it Bloody Newton. Ellsworth thrived from 1871 to 1875. Wichita had its turn next, shipping out 66,000 head in 1 year. And then came Dodge City. Dodge City became the queen of the cowtowns, the last and greatest of the Kansas Trail towns. From 1875 to 1885, more than 75,000 head of cattle shipped from Dodge City annually, with many more driven through on their way to northern ranges. Dodge was everything the legends say it was: dangerous, rowdy, and profitable. The gunfighters and lawmen of Western lore all passed through Dodge. Wyatt Earp served on the police force. Bat Masterson kept the peace with a walking stick and a reputation. Doc Holliday dealt cards in the saloons. Front Street was lined with establishments designed to separate cowboys from their pay. The Long Branch Saloon, the Alhambra, the Lady Gay Dance Hall. Boot Hill Cemetery filled with men who died with their boots on, victims of gunfights, accidents, and the general lawlessness that came with that much money and whiskey in close quarters. But even Dodge City's glory days were numbered. By the mid-1880s, several things combined to end the era of the great cattle drives. Railroads extended into Texas, making it easier to ship cattle from there. Homesteaders fenced the open range with newly invented barbed wire, cutting off the traditional trails. And Kansas itself began to change its character, becoming more agricultural, more settled, more civilized. The last big drive reached Dodge City in 1887. In the span of 20 years between 1867 and 1887, an estimated 6 million cattle were driven north from Texas to Kansas railheads. The Chisholm Trail and its sister routes created fortunes, built towns, and gave birth to legends that still define the American West. The cowboy became an icon, the cattle drive became mythology, and Kansas cowtowns became synonymous with frontier freedom and danger. Today, you can still see traces of this era. In Abilene, the old town and the museum at the historic Abilene Depot tell the story of those early days. In Dodge City, Front Street has been recreated, and you can walk into buildings that look like they did in 1880, though these days the only things you're likely to get robbed of are your tourist dollars. The Chisholm Trail is marked with monuments across Oklahoma and Kansas. And if you drive the back roads through the Flint Hills, you can sometimes still find old cattle pens or the faint traces of trails worn into the earth by millions of hooves. The Cattle Kingdom era was brief, but it changed Kansas forever. It brought money, people, and infrastructure. It connected the state to national markets and international trade. And it gave Kansas a place in the American imagination that it's never lost. When people think of the Wild West, they're often thinking of Kansas in the 1870s, a place where anything could happen, where fortunes were made and lost, where the law was whatever the man with the fastest draw said it was. It's a romanticized vision, certainly. The reality was harder, grittier, and less glamorous. But the legend endures, riding alongside us down the highway, a ghost in a 10-gallon hat, driving cattle that no longer exist to towns that have moved on. After the cowboys came the farmers, and if the cattle drives made Kansas legendary, it was wheat that made Kansas essential. The story of Kansas wheat begins with a people who knew something about hardship and perseverance. In 1874, groups of Russian Mennonites arrived in Kansas, part of a larger wave of immigration fleeing religious persecution and mandatory military service in Russia. They brought with them their families, their faith, their agricultural knowledge, and something else: seeds. Small bags of hard red winter wheat seeds from a variety they called Turkey Red, named for the region where they'd cultivated it in Ukraine. Now, wheat had been grown in Kansas before. The first wheat crop in Kansas was planted at the Shawnee Methodist Mission near present-day Fairway in 1839. But the spring wheat varieties that early settlers tried didn't do well. Kansas climate was tough, hot, dry summers, cold, unpredictable winters, periods of drought that could break a farmer's spirit as easily as his pocketbook. Spring wheat planted in March and April couldn't withstand the scorching heat of July and August. Yields were poor. Many people believed wheat simply couldn't be successfully grown in Kansas. But the Mennonites knew better. Turkey red was winter wheat. You planted it in the fall, let it germinate and establish roots before winter. The young plants went dormant during the cold months, then came back strong in spring when the moisture was best, growing quickly and ready for harvest in early summer before the worst of the heat arrived. This wheat had evolved to handle dry conditions and temperature extremes. It was perfect for Kansas. The first Mennonite settlements were in Marion and McPherson counties in central Kansas. They planted their turkey red wheat in the fall of 1874. The following summer, they harvested a crop that stunned their neighbors. The yields were good. The grain was high in protein with strong gluten, perfect for bread. And the wheat had survived conditions that had defeated other varieties. Word spread. Other farmers took notice. Within a decade, turkey red wheat was being planted across Kansas. By 1900, Kansas was producing more wheat than any other state in the nation. Today, turkey red wheat is the ancestor of all the hard red winter wheat varieties grown across the Great Plains. The Mennonites didn't just bring a crop to Kansas, they brought a revolution. They transformed the state's agricultural future and helped establish Kansas as what it's known as today. The wheat state, the breadbasket of the world. The numbers tell the story. On average, Kansas produces more wheat than any other state in the nation, accounting for roughly 1/5 of all wheat grown in the United States. In a typical year, Kansas farmers plant wheat on about 7.5 million acres and harvest around 300 to 350 million bushels. To put that in perspective, that's enough wheat to bake 36 billion loaves of bread. If you loaded all the wheat grown in Kansas in a single year onto railroad cars, the train would stretch from western Kansas all the way to the Atlantic Ocean. Wheat is grown in all 105 of Kansas counties, but it's most concentrated in the central and western parts of the state. Sumner County, down in the south-central region, typically harvests more wheat than any other county. But from the Colorado border to the Missouri line, from Nebraska down to Oklahoma, wheat is everywhere. In late fall and early winter, after the wheat has been planted, the fields are emerald green, a brilliant color that surprises people who think of Kansas as brown and dusty. By early summer, those same fields have turned golden, waves of grain moving in the wind like water in an ocean, ready for harvest. The wheat harvest is Kansas' Super Bowl, as one farmer put it. It typically begins in early to mid-June in the south-central part of the state and moves north and west, usually wrapping up by mid-July. Combines, massive machines that can cost $500,000 each, roll through the fields day and night, cutting, thrashing, and cleaning the wheat in one continuous operation. During harvest, small towns swell with custom harvesters who follow the wheat north from Texas to the Dakotas, contractors who bring their combines and crews to help farmers get their crop in quickly. Time matters during harvest. A hailstorm can destroy a crop in minutes. Rain at the wrong time can ruin the quality of the grain. So when the wheat is ready, you harvest, working from dawn past midnight if necessary, grabbing sleep when you can and praying the weather holds. The wheat from Kansas doesn't stay in Kansas. Half of it is used within the United States, ground into flour for bread, pasta, cereals, and countless other products. The other half is exported, shipped to countries around the world. Kansas wheat has fed relief efforts after natural disasters, supplied bread to nations that can't grow enough food for their own people, and provided the foundation for international trade relationships. When people call Kansas the breadbasket of the world, they're not exaggerating. The state is also home to major flour milling operations. Kansas has 12 flour mills with a combined capacity that makes it one of the top milling states in the country. These mills turn Kansas wheat into the flour that shows up on grocery store shelves and in commercial bakeries from coast to coast. But wheat production isn't just about tradition and volume. Kansas is also a leader in wheat research. Kansas State University in Manhattan is home to some of the world's foremost wheat geneticists and breeders. They work on developing new varieties that can resist diseases, tolerate drought, produce higher yields, and meet the changing needs of bakers and consumers. K-State developed wheat varieties have been the #1 planted varieties in Kansas for 9 out of the last 10 years. The research conducted in Manhattan influences wheat production not just in Kansas, but around the globe. Driving through Kansas during planting season or harvest, you can't help but be struck by the scale of it all. Fields stretching to the horizon, grain elevators rising like cathedrals in small towns, visible from miles away. Semi-trucks loaded with wheat heading to the elevators, to the mills, to the ports. It's agriculture on an industrial scale, but it's still fundamentally about farmers, about families who have worked the same land for 4 or 5 generations, who understand the soil and the weather and the rhythms of the seasons in a way that can't be taught from a book. These farmers face challenges that would break most people: commodity prices that swing wildly, input costs that keep rising, droughts that can last years, trade wars and tariffs that close off markets, the constant pressure to produce more with less while caring for the land so their children and grandchildren can farm it too. Yet they persist, planting every fall, praying over the winter, watching the fields in spring, and bringing in the harvest when summer comes. They do it because it's what they know, what their families have always done, and because they believe in the work. They believe in feeding people. They believe that what they do matters. And they're right. It does matter. Every time you eat a slice of bread, a bowl of cereal, a plate of pasta, there's a good chance some part of it started as seed in Kansas soil. The breadbasket of the world isn't just a nickname. It's a responsibility that Kansas takes seriously, has taken seriously for more than 140 years, ever since those Russian Mennonites planted that first turkey red wheat and proved that this supposedly barren land could feed the world. There's a place in Kansas that time forgot to change, a place where the original prairie still rolls on, mile after mile, looking much like it did when the first humans walked here 10,000 years ago. They call it the Flint Hills, and it's one of the most remarkable landscapes in North America. The Flint Hills run north to south through the eastern part of Kansas, a band of hills and grassland roughly 50 miles wide and 200 miles long. The name comes from the flint, or chert, to use the geological term, that lies scattered across the surface and embedded in the limestone bedrock. This area was formed about 280 million years ago during the Permian period, when Kansas sat at the bottom of a shallow sea. Over millions of years, layers of sediment settled on that ancient seabed: limestone, shale, and bands of chert. As the land rose and the seas receded, as wind and rain wore away at the rocks, the landscape we see today emerged. Rolling hills with limestone benches stepping down their sides, topped with a thin soil full of flint fragments. That rocky, shallow soil is exactly why the Flint Hills are still prairie. When settlers arrived in the mid-1800s, they took one look at this land and knew that plowing it would be a nightmare. The flint would destroy plow blades. The limestone lay too close to the surface. Farming here wasn't practical. So while the deep soil prairies of Illinois, Iowa, and Nebraska were plowed under and turned into cropland, the Flint Hills remained grassland. At one time, tallgrass prairie covered 170 million acres of North America, a vast sea of grass stretching from Texas to Canada, from Indiana to the edge of the Rocky Mountains. Today, less than 4% of that original prairie remains. Most of what's left is right here in the Flint Hills. It's one of the last places on Earth where you can stand on a hilltop, look in any direction, and see nothing but grass rolling away to the horizon, just as it did for millennia before Europeans arrived. The grasses themselves are remarkable. Big bluestem, which the old settlers called turkey foot because of the shape of its seed head, can grow 10 feet tall in good conditions. Indian grass and switchgrass reach nearly as high. Little bluestem, despite its name, grows 3 to 4 feet. These aren't the short grasses of the western plains. This is tallgrass prairie, and it earned its name. In late summer and fall, when the grasses are at their peak height and have turned shades of gold and rust and burgundy, walking through the Flint Hills is like wading through an ocean where the waves are made of grass, and the wind creates ripples that move across the hillsides like living things. Below ground, the root systems are even more impressive. Tallgrass prairie plants send roots 10 to 15 feet deep, seeking moisture during dry spells, anchoring the soil against erosion, creating a network so dense and tough that it once earned the nickname prairie marble. Those roots are why this landscape could support millions of buffalo. The grass could be grazed down to nothing, even trampled into dust, but as long as the roots remained, the prairie would come back. The Flint Hills are still grazed today, just by cattle instead of buffalo. Cattle ranching has been the economic backbone of the Flint Hills for more than 150 years. The calcium from the limestone enriches the grass, making it some of the most nutritious forage in the country. Every spring, ranchers bring in cattle from across Kansas, Oklahoma, and beyond. Young steers and heifers that will spend the summer gaining weight on the prairie. It's still a working landscape, still producing food, still very much alive. To maintain the health of the prairie, ranchers conduct controlled burns every spring. If you drive through the Flint Hills in March or April, you'll see smoke rising from hilltops as fires sweep through the dead grass from the previous year. These fires mimic the natural fires that once rolled across the plains, sparked by lightning, or set by native peoples who understood fire's role in maintaining the grassland. The burns clear away dead material, release nutrients back into the soil, control invasive woody plants, and stimulate new growth. A few weeks after a burn, the hills are green again, covered in new grass growing thick and strong. The Flint Hills aren't just biologically important, they're beautiful in a way that's hard to describe if you haven't seen them yourself. It's a subtle beauty, a quiet beauty. There are no dramatic mountains or forests or waterfalls, just grass and sky and the way the land rolls and folds, revealing hidden valleys and surprising vistas. The colors change with the seasons and the light. Spring brings green so vivid it almost hurts your eyes. Summer adds wildflowers, purple coneflowers, yellow sunflowers, white yarrow, blue asters. Fall turns everything to gold and copper. And winter in the Flint Hills is stark and severe. The grass gone dormant and pale, the hills etched in sharp relief, beautiful in their harshness. If you want to experience the Flint Hills properly, there are several places to go. The Tallgrass Prairie National Preserve near Strong City covers nearly 11,000 acres and includes hiking trails, an historic ranch house, and interpretive programs. It's the only unit in the national park system dedicated to preserving tallgrass prairie. The Kanza Prairie near Manhattan serves as a biological research station for Kansas State University and offers limited public access. And the Flint Hills Scenic Byway, running from Cassaday to Manhattan, takes you through the heart of the hills with pullouts and scenic overlooks where you can stop, get out, and just look. There's something about standing on a Flint Hills hilltop at sunset, watching the shadows lengthen across the grassland, that puts things in perspective. This land has been here for eons. It survived the ice ages, the extinction of the megafauna, the arrival and departure of countless human cultures. It endured drought and flood, fire and bison herds that numbered in the millions. And it's still here, still alive, still doing what it's always done, growing grass, supporting life, connecting the past to the present. The Flint Hills remind us that not everything needs to be developed, paved, or improved. Some places are perfect just as they are. And in a world that seems to change faster every year, there's comfort in knowing that the Flint Hills remain, rolling on under the big Kansas sky, looking much like they always have, and with luck and care, always will. When you're hauling freight across the country, there are routes you take because you have to, and routes you take because you want to. Interstate 70 through Kansas falls somewhere in between. It's a major east-west corridor, one of the main arteries connecting Denver to Kansas City and beyond, so there's plenty of freight moving both directions. But it's also a route that reminds you why you took to the road in the first place. Interstate 70 enters Kansas from Colorado near the tiny town of Colorado, and it exits 424 miles later into Missouri at Kansas City. That's the entire width of the state, border to border, a journey that takes you through 3 distinct geographical regions and shows you the many faces of Kansas. The western third of the state is high plains, flat to gently rolling, with horizons that stretch forever. The elevation at the Colorado border is around 3,500 feet, and as you drive east, the land descends gradually. This is wheat country and cattle country, where towns are few and far between, and the sky dominates everything. Colby, Oakley, Waukene, Hayes. These towns appear like oases along the highway, offering fuel, food, and a chance to stretch your legs before the next 40 or 50 miles of prairie. Around Salina, I-70 enters the Smoky Hills region, where the landscape becomes more varied. The hills are gentle, almost imperceptible if you're not paying attention, but they're there, creating a rolling topography that's easier on the eyes than the flatlands farther west. South of the highway at this point are the northern reaches of the Flint Hills, though you can't see them from the interstate. You'd have to venture south on K-177 or K-13 to get into the heart of the tallgrass prairie. East of Junction City, I-70 skirts the southern edge of the Flint Hills, offering occasional glimpses of those rolling grasslands to the south. The highway passes through small towns with good truck stops: Abilene, where the cattle trade once flourished; Manhattan, home to Kansas State University; and then Topeka, the state capital. At Topeka, I-70 merges with the Kansas Turnpike, becoming a toll road for the final stretch into Kansas City. That tolled section from Topeka to Kansas City runs about 40 miles and costs a few dollars if you have a transponder, a bit more if you don't. Some drivers hate tolls on principle, but the Kansas Turnpike section of I-70 is generally well maintained, with decent rest areas and not too much traffic, unless you hit Kansas City at rush hour. Lawrence sits halfway between Topeka and Kansas City, home to the University of Kansas, and the highway offers a good view of the town as you pass through. For truckers, I-70 through Kansas is a solid route. The road is in decent shape most of the time, though construction is a constant during the warmer months. There are plenty of truck stops, especially in the larger towns. The Flying J in Colby is a good one, and the TA in Salina is popular. Topeka has several options, and once you're in Kansas City, you've got your pick. The grades are manageable, nothing like what you'll face in Colorado if you keep heading west. The wind, though, that's another story. Kansas wind is legendary, and for good reason. There's nothing to stop it. No mountains, no forests, just hundreds of miles of open country for the wind to gather speed. In spring and fall especially, you can face sustained winds of 30 or 40 miles per hour, with gusts even stronger. If you're driving an empty trailer or pulling a light load with a lot of surface area, you'll feel every gust trying to push you around. It's not dangerous if you're paying attention and keeping both hands on the wheel, but it's tiring. Hour after hour of fighting that wind wears on you. Some drivers prefer I-80 through Nebraska for that reason alone, though Nebraska has its own wind issues. Weather in general is something to watch in Kansas. This is Tornado Alley, and spring storms can be severe. If you're driving through Kansas from April to June and you see a line of dark clouds building to the west or southwest, pay attention to the weather alerts. Most truck stops have TVs tuned to the Weather Channel, and your CB will be full of chatter about where the storms are and which way they're moving. Tornadoes move fast on the plains, and you don't want to be caught in one. I've sat in truck stop parking lots more than once, watching the sky turn green and the wind pick up, waiting for the storm to pass. It's humbling watching nature flex its muscles like that. But Kansas can also give you some of the most beautiful skies you'll ever see. Sunrises that paint the clouds in shades of pink and orange and gold. Sunsets that turn the whole western horizon into fire. Storms that approach from miles away, lightning flickering inside the clouds, the whole spectacle playing out on the world's largest stage. At night, if you're west of the cities where the light pollution is minimal, the stars are incredible. So many stars that the Milky Way looks like a cloudy band across the sky. You pull into a rest area at 2 a.m., step out to stretch, and there it is above you. The universe, vast and indifferent and beautiful. The cities along I-70 each have their own character. Topeka is governmental and subdued, with the Capitol Dome visible from the highway. Kansas City, split between Kansas and Missouri, is bigger and busier, with interchanges that can be tricky if you don't know them. Lawrence has that college town energy, especially visible if you drive through during the school year when the place is full of students. Salina has positioned itself as a midpoint stop, with enough hotels and restaurants that you can grab a meal and a shower and a bed if you need to reset. Hayes, farther west, has a similar feel but smaller, a plains town that's figured out how to serve travelers without losing its own identity. What makes I-70 through Kansas memorable isn't any one thing. It's the cumulative effect of all those miles, all those acres of wheat and grass and sky. It's the way the land teaches you patience, teaches you that not everything worth seeing is dramatic or instant. It's the rhythm of the road, the steady hum of tires on pavement, the slow progression of mile markers counting up and up. It's the small satisfactions, a clean restroom at a rest stop, a decent cup of coffee at dawn, a tailwind when you need one. Some truckers avoid Kansas, say it's boring, nothing to see. But those are the drivers who aren't paying attention. Kansas rewards observation. You notice the grain elevators that mark each town's location long before you can see the town itself. You start to recognize the different stages of wheat growth, green in spring, golden in summer. You see the cattle clustered in the shade of the few trees on hot afternoons. You watch the weather systems develop, track their movement, marvel at the power contained in those thunderheads. You appreciate the engineering of the road itself, the way the grades are designed to let water drain, the way the curves bank just right so you don't have to brake. Interstate 70 through Kansas is a working road, a freight corridor that connects the nation. But it's more than that too. It's a journey through the heart of America, through a landscape that's been shaped by geology, history, agriculture, and determination. And if you approach it with the right mindset, if you give it the attention it deserves, Kansas will show you things you didn't know you needed to see. The interstate shows you Kansas at 75 miles per hour, but the real stories live on the back roads, in the small towns that sit just off the highway or miles away from it. Towns with populations measured in hundreds rather than thousands. Towns where everybody knows everybody and strangers are still greeted with a nod and a howdy. These towns have names that sound like poetry or punchlines, depending on your mood. Bird City and Protection, Zurich and Moscow, Gas and Liberal, Loyal and Hope. Some were founded during the railroad boom of the 1880s, placed every 6 or 8 miles along the rail line. That was the distance a farmer could comfortably haul a wagon load of wheat to market and back in a day. Some were founded earlier, established as frontier outposts or way stations on trails heading west. A few are even older, Native American settlements or trading posts that predated Kansas statehood. What these towns have in common is resilience. Most of them have seen better days. Drive down Main Street in a typical Kansas small town, and you'll see empty storefronts, old movie theaters that haven't shown a film in 30 years, grain elevators that still operate but employ a fraction of the workers they once did. The young people have mostly left, heading to Wichita or Kansas City or out of state entirely, chasing jobs and opportunities that no longer exist in rural Kansas. The population has been declining for decades. Schools have consolidated, closing local buildings and busing kids to larger towns. Churches have merged congregations. Businesses have closed. But here's the thing, these towns haven't died. They've adapted. They've found ways to survive that would impress any business consultant. The local hardware store now also sells groceries because the grocery store closed. The gas station has added a cafe because the diner couldn't stay open. The pharmacy provides medical supplies and advice because the doctor only comes once a week. People do more with less, work multiple jobs, volunteer for the fire department and the school board and the church committee, because if they don't, nobody else will. And there's a quality of life here that cities can't match. Kids can ride their bikes anywhere without their parents worrying. Crime is almost non-existent, not because there aren't people with problems, but because everybody knows everybody and the social pressure to behave is strong. The pace is slower. People have time to talk, to help each other, to pay attention to things like neighbors and seasons, and the weather that actually matters because it determines whether the wheat harvest will be good or bad. Some of these small towns have become ghost towns, or near enough. You'll see them from the interstate sometimes. A water tower and a grain elevator visible in the distance, maybe a church steeple. But when you take the exit and drive there, you find that most of the buildings are empty or collapsed. The school is boarded up, the post office closed, the streets cracked and weedy. Only a handful of people still live there, mostly elderly, hanging on until they can't anymore. These places make you sad and thoughtful at the same time. They were somebody's home, somebody's dream. They thrived once, and now they're fading back into the prairie from which they came. But other towns have found new life. Some have embraced tourism, promoting local history or natural attractions. Nicodemus, in northwestern Kansas, is a National Historic Site preserving the story of African American homesteaders who founded an all-black town after the Civil War. Lucas, in north-central Kansas, calls itself the grassroots art capital of Kansas and attracts visitors with its strange and wonderful folk art installations. Wilson, in the Flint Hills, has seen a revival as artists and entrepreneurs have moved to town, attracted by cheap real estate and the beauty of the surroundings. And then there are the truck stops. Not the big corporate ones on the interstate, but the independent places on the back highways, the kind where the sign says, "Truckers welcome," and they mean it. These are the stops where you can get a chicken fried steak the size of your plate, where the coffee is always hot and the pie is homemade, where the waitress knows half the customers by name and asks about their families. The food isn't fancy, but it's good and there's plenty of it. And that's what matters when you've been on the road for 10 hours and still have 200 miles to go. There's a diner like this in Oakley, Kansas, off I-70, called the Buffalo Bill. It's been there since the 1960s, and it looks like it. But the food is solid and the people are friendly. Up in Russell, there's a place called Meridy's that serves breakfast all day and has a salad bar at lunch that locals swear by. These places are institutions, gathering spots, the closest thing small-town Kansas has to a town square anymore. The people in these towns, they're something else. They work hard, complain little, and help their neighbors without being asked. They have a dry sense of humor and a directness that city folks sometimes mistake for rudeness, but is really just honesty. They don't have time for small talk or pretense. If your truck breaks down on a country road, chances are someone will stop to help, or at least to ask if you're okay. They'll let you use their phone, give you directions to the nearest garage, maybe even give you a ride if you need one. There's a loneliness to these towns, too, particularly in winter when the light fades early and the wind howls across empty fields. You can feel isolated out here, cut off, especially if the weather turns bad and the roads close. But there's also a freedom, a sense that you're living closer to the land and the rhythms that governed human life for most of history. You're more aware of the seasons, more dependent on community, more connected to place. These small towns are dying, some people say, and maybe they're right. The population trends don't lie. But as long as there are people who choose to stay, who value the quiet and the space and the community, these towns will persist. They'll change, certainly. They'll get smaller, probably. But they won't vanish, not completely. Because Kansas has always been about stubborn persistence, about making do with what you have, about sticking it out when things get tough. And the people in these small towns embody that spirit as much as anyone who's ever lived here. Kansas has 4 distinct seasons, and each one will try to kill you in its own way. Spring starts gentle enough, with the snow melting and the wheat greening up and the first wildflowers appearing in the ditches. But then the weather turns mean. March and April bring the wild swings, 70 degrees one day, 30 the next, with the wind howling constant and the sky full of drama. This is tornado season, when the clash of warm Gulf air and cold Canadian air creates conditions perfect for severe storms. Kansas sits right in the heart of Tornado Alley, and the state averages about 90 tornadoes per year, most of them in spring. If you've never seen a Kansas thunderstorm, you haven't lived. They build on the horizon, huge towers of cumulonimbus clouds rising 40,000 feet into the air, anvil tops spreading out at the jet stream level. You watch them approach from miles away, see the dark core where the rain is falling, see the lightning flickering inside. And when they hit hard. Hail the size of golf balls. Wind gusts over 70 miles per hour. Rain so heavy you can't see the hood of your truck. And sometimes, if conditions are just right, a tornado drops from the base of the storm, a dark funnel connecting earth to sky, and everything in its path gets destroyed. The town of Greensburg, Kansas, was hit by an EF5 tornado in May of 2007, the highest rating on the enhanced Fujita scale. The tornado was 1.7 miles wide at its base and packed winds estimated at over 200 miles per hour. It destroyed 95% of the town, killed 11 people, and left a scar that's still visible today. Greensburg rebuilt mostly and used the opportunity to become a model for sustainable development. But the point is this: Kansas weather demands respect. Summer is hot. Not desert hot. Kansas has humidity thanks to moisture from the Gulf, but hot enough that working outside becomes a test of endurance. In July and August, temperatures regularly hit the mid to upper 90s, sometimes topping 100. The wheat harvest happens in this heat, with combines running 16 hours a day, their operators breathing dust and watching the temperature gauge on the engine, hoping nothing breaks down. Farmers and ranchers do their work in early morning and late evening when possible, avoiding the worst of the midday sun. But summer evenings in Kansas can be beautiful. The heat breaks as the sun goes down. A breeze picks up. The crickets and cicadas start their chorus. You sit on a porch or in a lawn chair, drink something cold, watch the light fade and the stars appear, and remember why people settled here in the first place. Fall is the best season, hands down. September and October bring mild temperatures, clear skies, and the changing colors of the prairie. The wheat planted in fall starts to emerge, covering fields in a fuzz of green. The cattle are moved from summer pastures. Hunters head to the fields for pheasant and quail season. The state fair wraps up. High school football fills Friday nights. There's a sense of harvest and completion, of things accomplished before winter arrives. And winter in Kansas is unpredictable. Some years it's mild, with little snow and temperatures that rarely drop below freezing. Other years it's brutal, with blizzards that shut down highways for days, ice storms that bring down power lines, cold snaps that freeze livestock in the field. The wind never stops. In January, with the temperature at 10 degrees and a 30-mile-per-hour wind out of the north, the wind chill can drop to 20 or 30 below zero. That kind of cold gets inside your bones, makes every task harder, makes you respect the pioneers who lived through winters here without central heating or electric blankets or weatherproof gear. The land itself changes character as you drive across Kansas from east to west. In the east, you'll find some trees, especially along rivers and streams. The terrain has more roll to it, more variation. Rainfall is higher, around 40 inches a year in the southeastern corner, and the farming reflects it, with corn and soybeans mixing in with wheat. As you move west, the land opens up and the rainfall drops. Central Kansas gets around 25 inches of rain per year. Western Kansas gets 15 to 20 inches, sometimes less. That difference shapes everything: what can be grown, how ranching is done, even the architecture of the towns. The farther west you go, the more you see the influence of limited water. Windbreaks become common around farmsteads, rows of trees planted to protect buildings from the constant wind. Center pivot irrigation systems appear in the fields, drawing water from the Ogallala Aquifer to water crops that couldn't otherwise survive. And the spaces between towns grow larger. Mount Sunflower, Kansas' highest point, sits in the far northwest corner at 4,039 feet above sea level. It's not a mountain at all, just a slight rise on the high plains, but it marks the elevation gradient that defines the state. From that point, the land slopes generally downward toward the east and south, dropping to about 680 feet at the point where the Verdigris River crosses into Oklahoma in the southeast corner. The Kansas landscape isn't dramatic in the way mountains or coastlines are dramatic. It doesn't shout for your attention, but it has a quiet grandeur, a sense of scale that's hard to comprehend until you've experienced it. Standing on a hilltop in the Flint Hills or the high plains, looking out over miles of grassland with nothing taller than yourself breaking the horizon, you feel your own smallness. You understand, maybe for the first time, what the word vast really means. It's humbling and exhilarating at the same time. And the sky. The Kansas sky is like nowhere else. Flat land means big sky, and Kansas has both. The sky isn't just above you. It surrounds you, goes all the way down to the horizon in every direction. Clouds are on display like artwork in a gallery, their shapes and shadows constantly changing. The sunrise and sunset shows last for hours, the colors shifting as the sun moves across the sky. And at night, away from city lights, the stars come out in numbers that seem impossible if you've only ever seen the night sky from a city or suburb. Kansas teaches you to pay attention to weather and landscape in ways that more temperate, more forested places don't require. Your life can depend on reading the sky, on knowing when to take shelter, on understanding what the wind direction means for tomorrow's temperature. And that attention, that necessity of observation, creates a different relationship with the natural world. You're not separate from it, not insulated from it. You're part of it, subject to its whims and graces, learning to work with it rather than against it. Modern Kansas is a blend of old and new, tradition and innovation, rural character and urban reality. The state's population is around 29 million people, making it the 35th most populous state in a nation of 50. About 60% of Kansans live in urban areas, primarily in the state's major cities. Wichita, the largest, with nearly 400,000 people, Overland Park and Kansas City in the northeast, and Topeka, the capital. The other 40% live in small towns and rural areas, working farms and ranches, maintaining communities, keeping traditions alive. Agriculture remains the backbone of the Kansas economy, but it's changed dramatically from the days of homesteading and small family farms. Today's Kansas farms are larger, more mechanized, more technologically advanced. GPS-guided tractors plant seeds with precision that would astonish farmers from even 30 years ago. Drones survey fields for signs of disease or water stress. Combines collect yield data in real time, allowing farmers to adjust their practices field by field, even acre by acre. It's farming as high-tech industry, driven by data and science as much as by experience and intuition. But agriculture isn't the only game in town. Kansas has aerospace manufacturing centered around Wichita, where companies like Spirit Aerosystems and Textron Aviation produce aircraft and aircraft components for both commercial and military use. The state has a growing renewable energy sector, with wind farms spreading across the high plains. Kansas ranks in the top 10 states for wind power generation. There's food processing, with beef packing plants in Dodge City, Liberal, and Garden City processing cattle raised on Kansas pastures. And there's education and healthcare and retail, and all the other industries that make up a modern economy. The challenges Kansas faces are real and significant. Rural depopulation continues, with young people leaving for opportunities elsewhere. The gap between urban and rural Kansas, between the prosperous suburbs around Kansas City and the struggling small towns out west, widens every year. Water is becoming an issue, particularly in western Kansas, where the Ogallala Aquifer is being drawn down faster than it recharges. Wheat prices fluctuate based on international markets that Kansas farmers can't control. And like everywhere else, Kansas is grappling with questions about education, healthcare, infrastructure, and the role of government. But Kansas has always faced challenges. Drought and locusts in the 1870s, the Dust Bowl and Great Depression in the 1930s, the farm crisis of the 1980s. Each generation has had to find its way through difficult times, and each generation has managed. The people here are good at enduring, at adapting, at making do. That's not to say the future is certain. It never is. But Kansas has survived this long not by being the flashiest or the biggest or the richest, but by being steady, practical, and determined. There's a character to Kansas and its people that's hard to quantify but easy to recognize once you've spent time here. It's a lack of pretense, a straightforwardness that some people mistake for simplicity but is actually clarity. It's a strong work ethic, born from generations of working the land and knowing that results come from effort, not wishes. It's a sense of community, of looking out for neighbors, of understanding that you're part of something larger than yourself. And it's a connection to place, to this particular landscape and this particular sky, that runs deep even when people leave. Driving through Kansas, whether on the interstate or the back highways, you're traveling through a place that matters. It matters to the nation because it grows food that feeds people around the world. It matters to history because events that happened here helped shape the course of American development. And it matters to the people who live here because it's home, with all that word implies: familiarity, belonging, identity, pride. As the sun sets behind me and the lights of Kansas City start to glow on the horizon, I think about everything this state contains. The battles fought on its soil, the wheat grown in its fields, the cattle that passed through its towns, the people who chose to stay when staying wasn't easy, the quiet beauty of its grasslands and the fierce power of its storms. Kansas isn't for everyone. It doesn't try to be. It's a place that demands something from you: patience, maybe, or attention, or a willingness to look past first impressions. But if you give it a chance, if you spend some time here, let the rhythm of the land get into your bones, Kansas will reward you. It'll show you sunsets that take your breath away. It'll teach you about weather and agriculture and the satisfaction of hard work. It'll remind you that there's more to America than coasts and cities, that the heartland isn't flyover country, but the foundation everything else rests on. I've crossed Kansas more times than I can count, and I'll cross it plenty more before I hang up the keys. Every trip is different. Different weather, different light, different thoughts running through my head as the miles roll by. But Kansas itself remains constant, steady, enduring. The horizon still stretches out forever. The wheat still grows. The wind still blows. And the highway still rolls on, carrying freight and stories and dreams across the width of the heartland. So here's what I'd tell you if you're about to drive across Kansas for the first time or the 100th time. Pay attention. Look around. Notice the small things, the way the light hits the grain elevators, the patterns the clouds make, the colors in the soil. Stop in a small town, grab a meal at a local cafe, talk to the people. Read the historical markers. Take a back road if you have time. Visit the Flint Hills if you can. Watch a storm roll in from a safe distance. Stay up late enough to see the stars. Kansas rewards attention. It rewards patience. And if you approach it right, it'll give you something valuable, perspective, maybe, or peace, or simply the memory of miles and sky and the steady rhythm of wheels on pavement, carrying you forward into whatever comes next. That's the magic of the road, isn't it? Every mile is both an ending and a beginning. Every town you pass through is someone's entire world. Every sunset you watch is one more day lived, one more story added to the long story of this land and all who travel it. Kansas understands that. Kansas embodies it. This state is all about the journey, about persistence, about taking what you're given and making it work. And if you can carry that lesson with you when you leave, then Kansas has given you a gift worth more than wheat or beef or anything you can measure in dollars. The exit for Kansas City is coming up. The truck stop off 435 will have parking, a hot shower, a decent meal. Tomorrow I'll head out again, maybe east into Missouri, maybe north into Nebraska. But tonight I'll sit in the parking lot for a few minutes after I shut down, stretch my legs, breathe the night air, and think about everything I've seen today. The wheat fields and the wind turbines, the small towns and the long highway, the endless sky and the ground that holds it all together. That's Kansas. That's the heartland. That's the road I travel, and I wouldn't trade it for anything. If this story found you somewhere along your own journey, I'm glad for it. And if you're heading across Kansas yourself, whether tomorrow or someday, I hope you see it the way I do. Not as empty space to get through, but as a place full of stories, full of history, full of people doing their best every single day. The wheat state, the breadbasket, the heartland. Safe travels, friends. Keep the rubber side down and your eyes on that horizon. I'll see you on down the road wherever the next load takes us. Until then, this is the stories of the American highways, signing off for now. Take care out there.